Hello and welcome to this series on government performance management. I am absolutely delighted that you have joined us for this session. This is a very special session. I spent 5 years of my life implementing government performance management in India. In fact, I loved the job and I was so convinced that I had something to offer that I resigned from my job at the World Bank, where I had worked for 15 years, and I took a plunge and accepted this government position, no doubt a good one. I was the Permanent Secretary for Performance Management in India from 2009 to 2014. And that is the experience I shall summarize here. I shall talk about what did we do during this time, what was new about it, why did we do it this way, why not some other way? And what was the international experience that informed our policy at that point? And finally, of course, what was the impact of what we did? Let me give you 3 examples of what we did. Some of you will know that Kerala is a small state in India. By India's size, it has a population of 1.3 billion, and Kerala is only 35 million. But it's a very progressive state, and they produced this following list. Here you can see all the departments are ranked with a score, with the Department of Agriculture getting 69.83 and other departments. So the question is, what did it mean? As you can see, this is a government order. So as government orders go, this was published in the Gazette. Many of us belonging to the Commonwealth countries know exactly what a Gazette is, where all the government orders are put for public information. So this was done openly. Then there is another state, and some of you may have heard of it. It's called Karnataka. It's a relatively medium-sized state which has a population of around 62 million. In fact, it's the IT capital of India. There you can see in the major newspaper, they were publishing the results openly. They were saying how they performed, who are the top winners and who are the worst departments. And finally, let me share this video about what was happening in the federal government. As you know, India has a federal structure. There is a central government, and then there are state governments. State governments are pretty autonomous. The central government is in charge of policies relating to law, foreign policy, defense, some of these policies. The states pretty much run the rest of the show. So here is what was happening at that time in Government of India.
It's time for ministers in the central government to know how they did in this last year.
The government's report card is out, and it's time to meet the toppers and find out who didn't quite make the cut.
It's time for the Ministers' report cards. Performance reports of 74 government departments is ready to be presented to Cabinet. NDTV has learned that the Cabinet Secretariat wants the top ministries to be awarded, but not everyone is happy with this, since in the long run, budgetary allocations will be decided by these performance reports. Have a look at the top performance in 2009-2010, the confidential list with NDTV now. These ministries topped with more than 90% marks. The School Education Department of HRD, the Information Technology and Post Department of the Ministry of Communications, Biotechnology Department of the Science and Technology Ministry, Ministry of Steel and Ministry of Corporate Affairs. However, ministries like the Information and Broadcasting Ministry did not do well with only 60% marks.
I'm happy that the ministries has performed well. We live in a democracy, so if there is ever a praise or a criticism of a certain aspect of a policy, we should be able to tweak it depending on the expectations and the aspirations of the people that we're working for.
The ministries are judged by the Cabinet Secretariat, the Planning Commission and the Finance Ministry, and it's a tough exam. Ministries getting less than 60% are classified as having fared poorly, and you have to get more than 90% to be classified very good and excellent. Critics say those who did well set themselves very low targets. For instance, they got higher marks for spending more money instead of the quality of their schemes which were implemented. The toppers, of course, feel this is right.
Ministry of Corporate Affairs is one ministry, where a lot of improvements have been done. if the e-governance is perfect here.
For a long time, public perception of the government used to be limited to landmarks like this, the Shastri Bhavan. But now we can have a more tangible sort of figuring out which department in Shastri Bhavan gets how much marks. Of course, whether those marks are made public or not is going to be decided by the Prime Minister within the next few days. In New Delhi, Sunetra Chaudhary for NDTV.
What is common between these three examples? What is common is that we were able to give a precise score. We were able to create the bottom line in the government, the missing bottom line. And that was our goal, and this is what we achieved. Now we achieved not only in the central government, where I was employed, I was a federal employee. The state governments did it on their own. It was completely demand driven. These states had nothing in common. They had different political parties, the entire spectrum. We covered, as I shall show you, from Communist Party to the most capitalist party, but they all believed in one thing, and it was demand driven. The chief ministers, who are the chief executive of these states, believed that government matters, that the key to comparative advantage and competitive advantage of states was the effectiveness and efficiency of government. So how did we achieve this? Well, we created a bottom line using an instrument called the Results Framework Document. It is very much like the Commitment for Result or any other document in this genre, such as the Performance Agreement, the Annual Performance Agreement in Bangladesh, or Performance Agreement in Bhutan, as you already know, or Contrat du Plan in France, or Contratos de Rendimientos in Costa Rica. A rose is a rose is a rose. The name doesn't matter, but in India, we will see that the Prime Minister decided the name to be Results Framework Document, even though the report had suggested the name Performance Agreement. So I'll start by describing what was this instrument. We will talk about what is RFD, how does it work, what were the origins of this policy, and what has been the progress in implementing RFD. So that would be the topic for the next few minutes. We will start by defining what is Results Framework Document. As you know, just like any other performance agreement, it is an agreement between a principal and an agent, where the principal on behalf of the people specifies to the agent, which is usually a department or a government functionary, that what is expected from them. And of course, you know that it is supposed to clearly define the expectations ex ante. And that's, in short, is what Results Framework Document policy in India was. And now, allow me to address a few other questions related to RFD. So let's talk about what is RFD. RFD is a very simple concept. RFD is a document which seeks to address three basic questions. It's first of all, what are department's main objectives for the year? What actions are proposed to achieve these objectives? And how do you determine the progress made in implementing these actions? That's all. These three commonsensical questions constitute what is called a Results Framework Document. The answer to these three questions is put in 6 sections of the Results Framework Document, and we will go through each one of them sequentially. So RFD consists of 6 sections. The answer to these 3 questions are embodied and contained in these 6 sections. Section 1 defines what is the department or ministry's vision, mission, objectives, and functions. So it tells us where is it that we want to go. It gives us the final destination. Section 2 then goes into the details, and it gives us what are the priorities among the key objectives, what are the success indicators for determining the progress that we make in achieving those objectives, and what are the targets. And this format is familiar to you. I will go into the details later on. The section 3 is on the trend values of the success indicators. This is very important. It is consistent with international best practice, where you have a medium-term expenditure framework. Most budgets are now presented in a 5-year time span. 2 years of actual data, this year's target, and 2 years projections. And that's exactly what Section 3 does. Section 4 is a definition, description of success indicators, proposed measurement methodology. Section 5 tells you what is expected from other departments for you to deliver what you are promising. So it gives you the specific performance requirements from other departments that are critical for delivering agreed results. Section 6 is the outcome impact section, which says that if everything goes well, if your theory of change is correct, then this is the outcome you should arrive at. Now, this is a memo entry. The key section is Section 2, which really is the heart of results framework document. Section 6, the outcome, I know of no country where outcome-based budgeting or outcome-based performance management has worked, for a very simple reason. Outcomes are long-term, and it takes 5-6 years to achieve anything meaningful in government, whether it's child mortality, bringing down hunger, poverty, or whether it is decreasing illiteracy and increasing literacy. Everything takes time in government if it's worthwhile. Now, if you were to evaluate the performance of government based on things which take 6, 7, 10 years to fructify, by then everybody would have left. Who would you hold accountable? Whose performance will you manage? There will be no one whose performance could be managed. Therefore, it is not a wise thing to use outcomes for performance management, that it is also equally, it is not wise to ignore them, because outcomes do matter in the long run. And if you find that you're doing well, you're achieving everything that you set out to do, yet you're not achieving the outcome, then you have to question the theory of change. What is it that you were trying to do to achieve these outcomes? The problem is not with the outcomes, but with what you thought would lead to these outcomes. So it's a time to reevaluate. So they are good for that purpose, but they are not good for evaluating the performance of the current manager. So before I move on, let me just emphasize the importance of Section 2 and just remind you, you should by now be very familiar with this section. It is the heart of the RFD methodology, which is this 4-step process. 3 steps are taken at the beginning of the year, where essentially in the first step you specify the exact performance criteria, the key performance indicator. And step 2 is where you specify your priorities. We know enough that if you do not do that, it's a non-starter. Don't get me started on that. Basically, you know that if you do 15 out of 20 things, it means nothing, because what you didn't know, we don't know whether that was important or not important. Essentially, anything that is not prioritized is not evaluation, whatever it may be. Step 2, again, very critical part of a good methodology, which is that you must be able to make distinction between good, bad, and ugly. If you have a single point target, as we have argued ad infinitum, that it is a non-starter. So if you give a target of 700 kilometers of road, my favorite example, and you achieve 645, what does it mean? Well, again, you're back to square one, because performance depends on the eyes of the beholder. If the person likes you, they'll say, that's good enough, let's move on. They don't like you, you're in trouble. Therefore, step 3 gives you the 5-point scale. It could be 7-point, 9-point, 3-point, but it's got to be a scale concept. Once you do this at the beginning of the year, at the end of the year, there is hardly any controversy. You have your achievements and you figure out the raw score, and you calculate the weighted raw score, and you add them up and you get the composite score. I have gone through this fast because this may be the 5th or the 6th time we have gone through this in this series. All right, let's get started. So you saw how the composite score is calculated using the 4-step process. Once you get the composite score, we were able to declare the results, and for a typical year, this is how it looked like. These are results from 2009-2010. If you look across the 4 years, you would find this is how the results looked. And you would find a remarkable consistency when it comes to the number of departments that were above average and below average. And that just shows that the system was quite stable and was beginning to give us good results, reliable results. But the best evidence came when you look at this chart, and the yellow chart there shows you that in 2011-12, we have almost a normal curve. We didn't do it like you would do in a university. It wasn't a professor doing a curve on the class, but it is how this reality worked out. There were some which were excellent, some that were quite poor, and majority of the departments were in the middle. This is what a system is supposed to be ideally. In a system, any population, there are few outliers who are excellent. They don't need performance management. They would always do well. In fact, sometimes it can be argued a performance management system can be a bit of a pain for those who are already charged up and ready to perform. But you need a system. The ones at the tail end, at the bottom end, in fact, no system really can do anything. There are some people who will always shirk responsibility and work, find shortcuts. The system is meant for 80% of the people in the middle. And that's what RFD showed, that by and large, it was taking care of the middle. We now come to how does the RFD process work? The process was quite simple, and that's the key to an effective implementation of a system. The process has to be simple to explain, simple to grasp, and simple to implement. It had a 3-step process. At the beginning of the year, we made the RFD, and I can go into the details, but basically we issued the guidelines, we held the meetings, and we negotiated the targets. That was at the beginning, and we prepared the RFD. But in the middle, we did not do heavy duty follow-up, because that is very important. You must let the managers manage. If you're always on their case and trying to micromanage them, they get discouraged. Once you tell them what's required, these are big boys and girls, permanent secretary level officers. They know exactly what to do. They need clarity, what you want. And that's what you need to do. And so we just did one follow-up, which was really a 6-monthly meeting to make sure there were no force majeures, acts of God, which required some intervention. And any target that required to be changed had to have the agreement of the Prime Minister and the Cabinet. So therefore, there were very few targets that were changed. It had to be a real unknown. Known unknowns you were supposed to manage. And at the end of the year, we did the evaluation. So it was basically a 3-step process, and it was easy to understand and easy to implement. How did the process work? That too also was not very difficult. It started with the minister approving the RFD. It was the permanent secretary and the minister who would discuss this. Permanent secretary, being the technocrat representing the department, would suggest the format. Minister, knowing the pulse of the people and having been elected, representing the cabinet in this case, would then modify that and either agree or disagree or modify the priorities or the targets. And once both of them agreed, this is the agenda for the year, then they signed off on it. And it went to the Cabinet Secretariat, which was where I was located, and it was the quality controlling department. We looked at it. We, in fact, got the advice of an advisory task force, which is a third-party, non-government group. They were all former secretaries, permanent secretaries, chief executives, former, had nothing to do with the government. Anybody in the government could not be part of it. So they were very distinguished people with great experience. For instance, if you're looking at the RFD for the Department of Agriculture, you would have 2 or 3 former permanent secretaries of agriculture who would know exactly what is required for this department and would, in a very nice mentoring sort of way, tell the younger permanent secretary what needs to be done. And there was the finest discussion that I ever saw. Very rarely there were disagreements which went up to the Cabinet Secretary for resolving. Once the advisory task force, the independent group, gave their advice, this went back to the department for their consideration after the approval of the Cabinet Secretary. Once the department had incorporated those changes, they were approved by the High Power Committee, which consisted of the nodal ministers, Ministry of Finance, HRD, Planning, etc., who were not running a sectoral department, but they had a global view. And so once they signed off, once they vouched for the fact that the targets in the RFD were the same as in the plan or in the budget, in the case of Ministry of Finance, then the Cabinet Secretary was able to take it to the Cabinet or to the Prime Minister for their approval. And once the RFDs were approved, they were required to be put on the website of the departments. And the process was not complete till the RFDs were placed on the website. So a completely transparent process, ending with an extremely transparent act of putting the entire RFD on the websites. So far we have looked at the concept of RFD and the process of making the RFD. Now let's spend a few minutes on the origin of RFD, which is very, very interesting. The RFD owes its origin to two major landmark reports. One, and both of them came out in 2008. One was the 10th report of the Second Administrative Reform Commission, which essentially said performance agreement is the most common accountability mechanism in most countries that have reformed their public administration systems. So it was a very strong endorsement that we need performance agreement. And government accepted the recommendation. In 2008 also, we had the 6th Central Pay Commission report. Now, Pay Commission in India is set up roughly around 10 years apart, headed by a very senior Supreme Court judge usually, and it has very distinguished members, highly respected, and they look at the salaries of the federal or the central government employees, and they try to adjust it, the structure and the level. So what happened was, in 1987, the 4th Pay Commission recommended that, look, we are increasing your salary, but we would like you to have a performance-related incentive. You can't get a huge raise without having some sense of connecting it with performance. The government agreed with their recommendation, but it quickly increased the salary, as was expected, but said we are working on a performance-related incentive scheme. That was 1987. Trust me, in 2008, the 6th Pay Commission made very strict observations that why hasn't this recommendation been implemented? We are giving you the last chance, and this time, please, there is no reason every time you accept and you do not implement performance-related incentive. So there were two major reports emphasizing performance to the government of India, the executive. And so it left with no choice. They had to have a performance management policy, because both required that you must know what the performance is, and that is the origin of the RFD, that is the origin of the Performance Management Division. That is also the reason why I was recruited from the World Bank to join the government, because government was under pressure to start looking at the performance. Now let's look at the last point, which is what has been the progress, or what was the progress in implementing the results framework document policy. Well, first thing to note is that the policy was formally announced in June 2009 by the President. A new government had just come into power after elections, and they were ready with this. And in the case of India, as in many Commonwealth countries, the President lays down the new government's policy in an address. And it says, my government will do it, but as you know, they are basically constitutional bodies, and they are just saying what the executive tells them to say. So in this case, the President of India announced that the government will, within 100 days, establish a mechanism for performance monitoring and performance evaluation in government on a regular basis. That was quite a dramatic commitment, that within 100 days they will do it. And sure enough, within 100 days, in September 2009, the Prime Minister issued an order to implement a performance monitoring and evaluation system, and which had RFD as its central piece. Since it started with a big bang and with a big momentum, the policy just continued. In fact, to the credit of the government, the then government and the Prime Minister and the Cabinet Secretary, they decided to cover every department. India has about 80 departments, which is, I think, one of the largest in the world, perhaps. China, I'm told, has 24, 25, so does United States, around that number. But India has 80 departments. So we were asked to cover all. Since it was a new department, a new policy, we did not have the capacity, so it was supply constrained, not demand constrained, and we went for 59 departments that we could handle in the first year of its operation. Second year, it increased to 62 departments. In 2011 to 2014, all 80 departments were pretty much covered. Not just that, 74 departments were actually doing the RFD. 6 of them were doing with their responsibility centers, which is subordinate offices, attached offices, and autonomous bodies and state-owned enterprises under these departments, which in all, if you take all 80 departments, we were covering about 800 responsibility centers under this policy. And remarkably, though this was a federal government policy and only central government departments were obliged to go for it, we found that 17 states were, by the time we left, were interested in implementing and had implemented at various stages. And those states included, this is the list. You will see it cuts across the political spectrum, and each one of them was at a different level. Some were very advanced. They had the RFD policy and they published the results. As you saw in the case of Kerala and as in the case of Karnataka, it was the same with Himachal Pradesh. I can name many. And they were excellent examples. And I was touched because there was no way that the federal government could dictate, but they really went on their own. The only thing that we did was any department that wanted assistance, we were more than happy to provide free of cost, and we were willing to share all our experience and expertise, and we did help to that extent, but it was demand driven. The scope of the RFD policy, that's very interesting. The scope changed. In 2010-14, we introduced the Citizens Charter, the grievance redress mechanism. Now, these are very important complementary policy to results framework document. The results framework document basically deals with the results that can be measured. You can certainly have customer satisfaction, but a Citizens Charter is a much more detailed document each department prepares, and we can talk about it later. So is grievance redress mechanism. ISO 9001 to codify the institutional memory. We will look into it later on, but these were made mandatory indicators under the RFD policy. So in a sense, the RFD policy provided that base, the foundation over which many reforms could be built and implemented. So RFD then becomes the kind of mother of all reforms. It created an enabling environment for other reforms to be implemented, and that, I think, is the beauty of having a government performance management system. It not only manages the performance of education, agriculture, and health, but also it manages the performance of the reform agencies and administrative reform departments. So you can see that we were expanding this scale and scope and doing these things systematically. Each one of them deserves its own session. So allow me to just skip now, and we will revisit this, and happy to share our experience in each of these. So far, we have looked at why did we do what we did. Now, the question is, what is new about it? Everybody does something. In the name of performance management, jobs are created, people do something. But what was new about it? Well, let me take you back to our previous sessions where we made the distinction between monitoring and evaluation. And you know the difference, that if you take a flight, going from point A to B on time, arriving on time, having a wonderful service throughout is a good flight. That's evaluation. You said I had a good flight. But monitoring is what you saw is done in the cockpit by the pilots. They are the ones who are looking at the tailwind, the headwinds, the temperature inside, outside, the amount of fuel, the balance of the fuel, the balance of the weight, etc. There are so many parameters they look at it, and you know it's a scary picture. So there are two different things. We have established that earlier on. Now, within the evaluation, this is also not new. Governments have been doing evaluation ever since they were formed, but they used to look at budget. Then they went to performance budget, outcome budget, and then they have now come to RFD. As you know, the budgets were focused on finance. Performance budgets added activities and outputs to it. Outcome budgets then went on to add outcomes, saying that activities and outputs are not enough. We must focus on outcomes. But never really, they just put the outcomes. There has been no successful experience that I am aware of. And that's why RFD was coined, which is the most expansive, the most comprehensive definition of performance of a department. It includes everything, inputs, activities, and even outcomes, non-financial, financial, static, dynamic indicators, which deal with future. So all things are and can be included in RFD. So it truly is the most comprehensive definition. Now, if you look at this table, which is the meta-evaluation, where I've compared all the various systems, you see the last column where we have RFD. It has many yeses, and the rest of the systems did not have those. I will leave it to you for going into the details, and it's all written up. But I want to focus here on the three very important aspects. First, what made RFD and this whole genre of approaches, the performance agreement and commitment for results approaches, is that their objectives, actions, and success indicators were prioritized. Second, the deviations agreed were ex ante, and they agreed on deviations. They did not just take a single point target. So these three elements stand out as the critical elements because other approaches did not have, so they just struggled, and basically they waited till they could develop a new innovation. But now we have reached a point where we think it's a very, very comprehensive definition of performance, and it's here to stay, and that's why it is being used in many, many countries. So now we come to why do it this way? There are many ways. Even if it's a great policy, why do it this way? To the conclusion, why do it this way? We really need to diagnose the problem. We must have a proper diagnosis. Once we have diagnosed, we must have a proper prescription. And then the overall approach must be consistent with management theory and the march of history. When it comes to diagnosis, you're already aware there are two classic problems of which face all government departments. One is the problem of multiple principles with multiple objectives, and therefore the managers in the government do not know what is expected from them. Now the problem is this manifests itself, or it is caused by fragmented authority. To do something, 5 people are responsible, therefore they don't know what is their precise responsibility, and fragmented institutions. Often to do the same thing, 5 institutions in the government are responsible, or multiple institutions. And that's why we have multiple principles with multiple objectives, where objectives are often conflicting. So that's our classic problem. We have gone through it. The other thing that can be said in the context of diagnosis, we already know the not me syndrome, where we saw that people start blaming, and they are the ones who get blamed because everybody passes the buck and say, it's not me. I am not responsible for the poor performance. In fact, if you see this one, this is the third one, which is very true for public enterprises which have a financial deficit, but when you look at it, the financial deficit is really a symptom of the underlying cause of a performance deficit. So these are what we can say well agreed, well established, generally accepted reasons for poor performance of government and public enterprises. So what is the prescription? Well, again, just to remind you, we already know that all experts agree that 80% of the performance of any organization can be explained in terms of its systems, only 20 in terms of its people. And within that 20, 80% of it is leadership. So all you need is a good system with a great leader and miracles can happen. So that's the prescription that one would go for. Then the other is a very classic approach. It's not that we have just discovered that governments are not delivering what was expected from them. This has been going on, but there have been two kinds of responses to this. One is that if government is not delivering, reduce the quantity of government. That is privatization, traditional civil service reform, what used to be called the Washington Consensus, privatize, liberalize, deregulate, as if free markets will take care of everything. And we realize that's not the case, and therefore the pendulum has swung on the other side, which is you cannot do away with the government, you have to improve its quality. And in doing so, you have two approaches. One is the trickle-down approach, which is the CFR and the RFD, and the other is the direct approach. The direct approach will be like the ISO 9000 initiative, the Citizens Charter, grievance redress. They don't wait for a very big system. They say, look, we need to specify what do citizens want, how do we get to their grievances and resolve them. So these are the two. Trickle down it's called because when you have the RFD at the top, it takes a while for the accountability to trickle down. So those are the two broad categories, and clearly you know where we belong. We believe that increasing the quality of government is a more sensible approach, and there the long run approach is the CFR, which is kind of the trickle down, but it can be complemented with other approaches, but it's not a substitute. ISO 9000 is not a substitute for a good government performance management system, nor is grievance redress alone is a substitute, but they are complements to a good government performance management system. Then, why do we do it this way? One other element is the theory tells us, and just to remind you once again, we've gone through this, that the overall approach is the story of three stools. That government performance management requires a strategy, a vision. If you have a vision, the end point, you must know how to get there. And that's not enough. You must also know how to implement. So you need the vision, the destination. There are many paths. You need to know how to get there. And once you have determined the path, you must have a way to measure your progress and the milestones up to the vision. The second, which I call the story of three stools, the second stool which captures the essence of this is the performance improvement. We know that performance improvement requires three systems. You must have good information, but that's not enough. If you have good information, it must be complemented with a good evaluation system. You must know how to evaluate that information. You can have all the information, but if you can't evaluate and make sense of it, then it's useless. Once you are able to evaluate, then no matter how good your evaluation system, that if it has no consequences, that is, if there are no incentives, positive or negative, performance doesn't take place. So performance improvement requires all three systems. And finally, perception. It's terribly important that government perception, often governments get very disheartened because they work very hard to improve their performance. Their perception, however, doesn't improve, and often they lose elections. And they say, so what good is performance management? Well, if you are careful, you must realize that improving your perception of how well you're doing, whether you're delivering or not, is not simply about achieving results. It's also about managing the interface between citizens and the government. If you do not treat them well, you don't have a good citizens charter, you don't have a good, effective grievance redress mechanism, I'm afraid all your good work will go to waste because people will not give you the benefit of doubt. Now here is a true story that in 2010 we were ready with our results for the first time because we started the policy in 2009 and 2010 we were ready with the results. Guess what? 5 days before we were about to announce our results from the Cabinet Secretariat, the Performance Management Division, we had the list that I showed you a little while ago. The leading newspaper or the magazine called India Today had this cover story. It called it the Underperforming Alliance, and they had a list of rankings. They gave every department a mark, and we thought, my God, they've got the coup. How did they do it? We spent a year organizing meetings, looking at the targets and talking to people and experts, and here they were, a magazine which had already done what we were doing. We were ready to go to the PM, so we were very curious. We asked the editor, how did you come to this conclusion? The editor said, sir, this is not a rigorous exercise. He was very honest, a very good friend of mine, and he said, basically what we did was we set up an internet portal and asked everybody to vote. Clearly, it was subjective. People who have access, there may have been some campaigning. Those who were technically savvy may have got their people to vote for it. Who knows? But this was completely random and subjective. But the interesting thing is, we came up with our own result. How did this match up? Well, the way to compare two lists, rankings, is something called the Spearman correlation. To match two rankings, we call it Spearman rank correlation. Whether the rankings are correlated or not, we got a value of 0.02, which means they were not correlated. Ours was based on concrete evidence-based data approved by the government. That was based on perception. And look at the difference. The difference was enormous. And look at the difference, it was enormous. RFD score on average was 89%. India Today score was 39%. So what explains the difference? We thought it confirms what I just said, that perception depends on achieving targets, but more importantly on the quality of interface as well as communication. Communication is terribly important. How you communicate, whether you communicate. And I think if our targets were 89 and the perception was 39, then clearly the problem was that we were getting -50 in the other two categories. So it was clear that government had to do something about communication and had to manage its interface. And that's why next year we introduced Citizens Charter, grievance redress. We ramped up our effort even at communication, but that story is not a very successful one. The government did not communicate well, and that's why it had the consequences it had. Another way to look at this is, the determinants of perception in our view and from the experiences, perception depends on results, but to a large extent it also depends on how you communicate and treat the citizens. So having a citizens client charter, clearly communicating what you're going to do and what you have done is important. And obviously everybody can't be happy. Those who are not happy, if you don't have a good, effective, timely grievance redress mechanism, I'm afraid perception can't be improved. So that's what it is. And I came up with this equation that perception is 1 stands for results, 2 to the power 2, which is Citizens Charter to the power 2. Exponentially is very important, but 3 to the power 3. Grievance redress is very important, more important than anything else. Okay. So why do we do it this way? Why did we do it this way? Another important part was the international experience. We studied the international experience and came to the conclusion, of course, the this 10th report of the Second Administrative Reform Commission, which had all the resources studied and came to the conclusion the most effective approach is performance agreement, which we called results framework document, and now the much more commonly accepted name is commitment for results. You know, as I've said, New Zealand was the first one to start. We looked at their experience and we studied it and we improved on it. They did not have prioritization and they had single point targets. That's why their experience was not going anywhere. We improved on that experience, and other countries had done it before us. There were public service agreements in UK, but the most inspiring one was the one in the USA, where President Bill Clinton had performance agreements, wonderful documents, except they were also missing the best practice methodology, but they had everything, including signature of the president and the secretary, in this case, Secretary Hazel O'Leary, who was the secretary for the Department of Energy. And sure enough, as predicted, the accountability started to trickle down. Once the secretary signed the performance agreement, the secretary signed with assistant secretary and downwards. You have already seen this in the case of America, the president's agenda. And I love this quote from President Bush, who says the government should be results oriented, guided not by process, but guided by performance. There comes a time when every program must be judged either a success or a failure. Where we find success, we should repeat it, share it, and make it the standard. And where we find failure, we must call it by its name. As you have already seen, I will not repeat, President Bush had this color-coded system where he, yellow meant come see, come sa, red means not good, green meant good. And so you can see that while most of the achievements were still quite yellow, but the progress was quite green. So that means they were making progress, they had not reached that point. I will not belabor this point, but just to tell you that we studied all these systems before we came out. This you have seen, remarkable that President Bush used to put all his scorecards on his website, and they're still available. He placed the scorecard. So we got this inspiration about having the scorecard and making it public from the experience of USA. But the earliest experience is, of course, Mahathir Mohamad, who way back, had a performance agreement, he called them program agreements, excellent documents. If you see these, they are inspirational. And they were the ones which inspired us to have a section on outcome, because Malaysia had impact indicators. They were all long-term, but they still had them as one of the last sections so that you could keep the eye on the ball. Why are you improving the roads if the rate of deaths on the road is not going down in the long run? So that is the reason why outcomes matter, but they can't be used for performance evaluation because they're too long-term. Of course, it has spread all over. You've seen already, you're very familiar now with the Kenya case and RFD. All states had this. If you look at they used to not only publish, they used to publish them publicly. They brought out compendiums which were available to everybody. Finally, let us look at the impact of what we did. We have gone through this in other sessions, so I will not belabor the point, but just to remind you, here is some evidence that we feel is conclusive. Grievance redress mechanism in India were being implemented since 1997, but nobody really cared, and therefore the numbers of disposal, which is the way to measure grievance redress, is how many grievances received or disposed. Only about 50% of the grievances received every year were being disposed. Once we introduced the system in 2009, you see in 4 years' time, all grievances were being reduced. And in fact, we had introduced a quality indicator, so the citizens could also say whether they felt good about the whole process. Now, their grievance may not be cured. If you go to a doctor, it's not certain they can cure the disease, but the way the doctor treats you and the way the doctor tries, you always tend to give them credit and say, look, they tried their best. It's not their fault. God was not on our side. So that is the same thing with the grievance redress. Now, if you look at number of these indicators, And we found so many of these success stories. I have gone through this earlier, but just to tell you that the CAG in India, when it makes an observation, is called a para. There were paras, the ministries were not caring about it till we put it in the RFD, and suddenly the performance improved from having a cumulative 4,216 paras. In 4 years' time, there were 533. Not only ministries were taking care of the new paras, but they were clearing the backlog. That is the power of performance management. And if you look at solar power, fresh capacity addition suddenly increased, not because money increased, not because the policy changed, simply the implementation improved. And that was the story throughout. And so it gave us this feeling that RFD really had a positive impact. All right, finally, let us look at whether RFD is consistent with the generally accepted performance principles. How did it do? Well, the number one is appropriate performance measurement methodology. It certainly had the most appropriate performance measurement methodology, and it was implemented well. Take my word for it. Since in the 5 years we did not have any complaints, we did the best possible effort. It was internationally well recognized. We benchmarked ourselves against all others by holding an international conference called the Global Roundtable on Government Performance Management, and you should have a look at the proceedings of that to see the comparison and contrast with other countries, large and similar countries like Brazil, South Africa, USA, and others. Two, whether it had the appropriate performance measurement methodology. Yes, it did. It was, there's no doubt, I will not belabor, but take my word for it, and you've seen it. I think we can quickly agree. It had whole of government coverage, no doubt about it. It covered, and very fast. It was in fact whole of country coverage, the way things were going. Accountability from the top, yes indeed. There was accountability from the top. The ministers were being held accountable, and then the permanent secretaries, and down the line. Explicit and unambiguous assignment of accountability. Yes, it was by name. People knew who was accountable. Appropriate incentive system. I can't say it was appropriate incentive system. There was incentive. People got to know, and everybody fought for every single point. But I don't think government was able to. They wanted to bring out the performance-related incentive scheme, which was one of the main objectives, but that's a whole different story. I will have a separate section on that, but I think on this, the government does not. It had implicit, just when you start a system, the permanent secretaries were very worried about how they're going to look, whether they will get any special assignment, and they used to call me, so I know there is anecdotal evidence that everybody charged up and changed, but for having a systemic and long-term sustainable change and impact, you have to have an explicit performance-related incentive. So I don't think India gets any marks for that. It may get just 1 or 2 out of 10. That's about all. Effective integration with the HR system, no, it never reached that stage, so there was no effective integration with the HR system. It was in the pipeline, but it didn't happen. Integration with the budget system, yes, in a sense, but not perfect. It was integrated. Every target in RFD was consistent with the budget targets, and the Ministry of Finance, particularly the Permanent Secretary of Finance, was supposed to sign off on that. Only then the RFD was approved. So you can say they were consistent. But there are better ways of making that consistency, and we'll talk about that. So it gets 8 out of 10, I would say, with the integration with budget system. Transparency, yes, it was totally transparent in its design, in its functioning, and at the end. In fact, at the end, the reports, the RFD reports were being put on the table of the Parliament. The annual reporting system changed. Annual reports till now, till the point RFD was introduced, used to be publicity documents. You would put all the things that made the department look nice, but not put all the facts, especially the failures. RFD is an objective report. It is the counterpart of a financial statement in the private sector. They are put before the board. Similarly, the annual reports included RFD, which is being presented to the board. In this case, it's the Parliament. Appropriate institutional arrangements? Yes, there were appropriate institutional arrangements, whichever way you look at it. It was the body which conducted this was located in the Prime Minister's office. That is, I was reporting directly to the Prime Minister, and Cabinet Secretariat is where we were located for administrative purposes. So it was at a very high level. That's one of the reasons. It was independent. It wasn't based in a sector ministry, and it had direct access. So these are some of the requirements. And we had, of course, very highly qualified people. That's a story to be told. What we did was, obviously in government people are not trained in this, but we borrowed people from public enterprises, from their corporate divisions, which knew what performance management was. So these people were brought in on secondment, and they did a wonderful job. We call them the resource persons, and they were critical in making this system very, very effective. Effective communication strategy? No, it was at our level. We were communicating. As a professor, of course, I was happy to talk, gave talks, but since our Prime Minister was not inclined to speak too much, it was very difficult to really cross the bounds and be too enthusiastic, because the upper ceiling on communication is laid by the leadership. Leadership has to say a few things, and then the permanent secretaries can expand on it. But if the leadership says nothing and mum's the word, then there's only that much a permanent secretary or a civil servant can do. So communication strategy, I think Government of India failed quite miserably. Strong and unambiguous legal foundation. This was a fatal flaw. We did everything. It was based on a Prime Minister's executive order, and when the government changed, it's easy to change the executive order, and that was a fatal blow. So therefore, any system which is worth building and putting your hard-earned labor into it, you must make sure that it's sustainable. First and foremost is sustainable. When you are very busy, you're in the middle of it, you tend to think this is how the world will be for the next 50 years. Believe me, it's never 50 years. If you last for 4 years, I lasted in the government for 5 years, which is one of the longest tenures for a secretary in the government of India, but that wasn't long enough. Unfortunately, the legal foundation was our Achilles heel, and that is the reason why RFD has regressed. Though the Prime Minister is supportive, it was part of his election manifesto, but there were forces that would ensure that this accountability did not catch on. Thank you very much. We'll talk about more next time.